When his fingers brushed against me, it wasn't just the shock of the moment, it was the flood of everything I was trying to suppress. That night changed everything. What do you do when the forbidden is no longer just a thought, but a touch, a choice, a consequence? Stay tuned, because this story will take you into the deepest secrets of my life. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. When David's hand brushed mine as he reached for the sponge, the world seemed to stop for a moment too long. I froze, staring at the streak of water running down the sink, wishing my pulse would calm. His voice, low and laced with casual warmth, cut through the charged silence. "Let me help. Mum, you've been scrubbing all evening." The word mum fell from his lips heavier than it should have. I laughed nervously, pulled my hand away, and gave him a smile that felt thin even to me. "It's all right, sweetheart. I've got it under control." David stood close, closer than he needed to be in the small kitchen. The dim light above the counter cast a soft glow over his face, his sharp features shadowed in a way that made him look older than his 22 years. I turned my attention back to the soapy plates, my hands shaking slightly as I scrubbed. "You work too hard," he said, his tone somewhere between teasing and sincere. "Seriously, Dad's always saying you should relax more." I couldn't bring myself to look at him. "Someone has to keep this place going." There was an unspoken weight in the air, like the silence before a thunderstorm. My husband, Charles, had just left for another night shift at the hospital. It was routine by now, him slipping out the door with a kiss on my cheek and a promise to be back in the morning. But tonight felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on why. David leaned against the counter, his voice softening. "You shouldn't have to do everything yourself, you know." I looked at him, finally meeting his blue eyes, which always seemed to hold a quiet intensity. "It's part of being a wife and a mother," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "Maybe it shouldn't be," he said, his gaze lingering. The words sat between us, their meaning unclear but undeniably significant. I dried my hands on a tea towel, eager to escape whatever was unfolding. "Why don't you go and choose a film? I'll join you in a minute." He nodded, pushing himself away from the counter with a wry grin. "Deal, but you pick out the snacks." I managed to laugh, relieved, as he walked out of the kitchen. The moment passed, but the echo of it lingered, stirring something I didn't want to name. The living room was cozy, the glow from the TV casting soft shadows on the walls as David scrolled through our streaming options. I put a bowl of popcorn on the coffee table and sank into the armchair opposite the couch. It was safer this way, the distance between us, the buffer of space keeping everything normal. "Come on, sit over here," he said, patting the cushion beside him. "You're too far away. It's not like we haven't shared a couch before." I hesitated, but his teasing grin made refusal seem dramatic. "Fine, but only because I'm too tired to argue." I slid onto the couch, leaving enough space between us to fit another person. David grinned but said nothing, his focus returning to the screen. He'd chosen a light-hearted comedy, something we'd watched together years ago when he was still at school. Nostalgia wrapped itself around us like a familiar blanket, and for a while everything felt simple again. Halfway through the film, his arm stretched along the back of the couch, casually resting against my shoulder. It wasn't unusual, but tonight the gesture felt different. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired and reading into nothing. Yet my body betrayed me, tense and hyper-aware of every movement. "Relax," he said softly, his voice close enough to stir the hairs on the back of my neck. "You're tighter than usual." I laughed awkwardly, shifting in my seat. "Long day, that's all?" He didn't answer, but the weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. The warmth of his arm against mine, the subtle scent of his cologne, it all pressed down on me in a way that felt both comforting and suffocating. I concentrated on the film, determined to keep my mind from wandering into dangerous territory. As the credits rolled, I abruptly stood up and picked up the empty bowl. I'll clean this up, I said, eager for the sanctuary of the kitchen. David followed, leaning against the door as I rinsed the bowl. You're avoiding me, he said, his tone half joking, but with an edge that made my stomach turn. Don't be silly, I replied, keeping my back to him. I just don't like to leave a mess. He chuckled and moved closer until he was just behind me. You're not a very good liar, Mum. The words hung in the air, his voice softer now, almost challenging. I turned to face him, the damp bowl clutched in my hands like a shield. What does that mean? He shrugged, his gaze steady but unreadable. Nothing. Just that I know you better than you think. I searched his face, trying to decipher the mix of emotions there. It was a dangerous game, one whose rules I didn't know. Go to bed, David. It's late. For a moment he looked like he was going to argue, but then he smiled. Soft, almost tender. Good night, Mum, he said, brushing past me as he left the room. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his words and the look in his eyes sinking into me. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where I sat with my coffee. The air was cool, crisp, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. David's words from the night before echoed in my mind, leaving an unsettling warmth in their wake. I tried to shake it off, concentrating instead on the mundane tasks of the day. Shopping lists, errands, laundry. All the things that should have filled the hours. But even as I folded my husband's shirts or filled the pantry, my thoughts drifted to David. Late in the afternoon, he emerged from his room, his hair disheveled, and a slight smile on his face. Hey, Mom, he said, grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on me for just a beat too long. Good morning. Well, afternoon, I replied, my voice betraying none of the unease I felt. Late start for you. He shrugged and leaned against the counter. You know me, I'm not a morning person. I busied myself wiping the counters, avoiding his gaze. Plans for the day? Not much. Thought I'd hang around, maybe help you with a few things. I looked at him then, raising an eyebrow. Help me. Who are you and what have you done with David? He grinned, the familiar charm in his expression easing the tension between us. I'm full of surprises. The day passed in a blur of domestic chores, David hovering closer than usual. He helped with the shopping, fixed a squeaky door hinge, and even offered to fold the laundry, a task he had avoided his entire teenage life. At first, I welcomed the company, grateful for the rare moments of connection. But as the hours passed, the invisible thread between us grew tighter, pulling us into a shared orbit that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. That evening, after dinner, he lingered at the table while I cleared the plates. My husband was working late again, and the house felt too quiet, the space between us too charged. You're really on top of things, David said, his voice warm. I don't know how you do it all. I shrugged. Carrying the dishes to the sink, you just manage. It's part of the job. He stood up and moved to join me at the sink. His presence was palpable, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Maybe you shouldn't have to do everything yourself. I froze, the plate in my hand slipping slightly before I caught it. David, I began, my tone firmer than I had intended. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked, his voice firm but gentle. It's not like I'm wrong. His words sent a chill through me, a mixture of fear and something I couldn't put my finger on. I turned to face him, meeting his gaze with as much determination as I could muster. Because it's not appropriate. For a moment, the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. Then he stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I exhaled, the breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaping me in a shaky sigh. I know what you're thinking, she said. The days that followed were a careful dance, each of us testing the edges of the invisible line between us. David kept finding reasons to be around me, helping with the housework, going with me on errands, lingering in the living room after dinner. I told myself it was innocent, that I was overthinking things, but the way his gaze lingered, the way his touch lingered in the briefest of moments, told a different story. One evening, as we sat on the sofa watching television, he reached for the blanket that was draped over the back. "Here," he said, spreading it over my legs. "You looked cold." "Thanks," I murmured, pulling the material tighter around me. He settled back into his seat, his arm again resting on the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. The show continued, but I was barely aware of it, concentrating on the rhythm of his breathing and the occasional movement of his hand. "You seem distracted," he said suddenly, his voice low. "I'm not," I replied too quickly, my eyes fixed on the screen. "You are," he countered, leaning forward slightly. "Is it something I said?" She said, "No." I said, my voice was firmer now, "David, I think we need to set some boundaries." His brow furrowed, and for the first time, he looked genuinely hurt. Have I done something wrong? The question caught me off guard, the sincerity in his tone disarming. "No," I admitted, "but spending so much time together, it's starting to feel—" He sat back and nodded slowly. "I understand." I felt a pang of guilt at the defeated note in his voice, but I forced myself to ignore it. "Thank you." Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Had I done the right thing? Or had I overreacted to something that was never there? My thoughts were a tangle of guilt, doubt, and a lingering warmth that I couldn't quite shake. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled me. I sat up, my heart pounding, as there was a soft knock at the door. "Mom?" David's voice was subdued but clear. I hesitated before answering. "What is it?" The door creaked open, and he stood there, silhouetted in the dim hallway light. "I just wanted to say goodnight." "Good night," I replied, my voice shaking slightly. He lingered for a moment before going inside. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He crossed the room and paused at the edge of the bed. "You seem upset. Haven't I upset you?" "No," I said quickly. "It's just been a long day." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable around me." "I don't," I lied, the words catching in my throat. He then reached out and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. "I care about you," he said softly. I swallowed hard, my eyes dropping to the blanket. "You're important to me too, David. But we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." For a moment we sat in silence, the unspoken words between us heavy and suffocating. Then he stood, his hand falling away. "Good night, Mum." As he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him, I lay back against the pillows, my heart pounding in my chest. Sleep would not come easily tonight. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering tension of the night before. I threw myself into housework, scrubbing counters and folding laundry, as if sheer effort could cleanse the unease simmering beneath the surface. David was in his room, probably asleep, and I was grateful for the space. But by midday, the house was filled with his presence again. He padded into the kitchen, his hair disheveled from sleep, and a slight grin on his face. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Afternoon," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "You slept in." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter as he watched me prepare lunch. "Late night, I guess." I avoided looking at him, concentrating instead on chopping vegetables. "We've all had them." He chuckled softly, and for a moment the tension eased. It almost felt normal. the kind of easy banter we used to have. But then his voice softened, catching me off guard. Mom, about last night. I froze, the knife still in my hand. David, let's not. I just want to make sure we're okay, he said quickly, his tone serious. I didn't mean to cross any lines. There is more screaming. Oh dear. I put the knife down and turned to face him. We're fine, I said firmly. But we have to be careful, David. Whatever this is, it's not healthy. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, searching my face. I don't want to make it harder for you. You're not, I lied, offering a tight smile. Let's just move on, shall we? Okay, he said, although the weight in his eyes said otherwise. That evening, my husband called from the hospital, his voice tired but cheerful. Hey, babe, just checking in. Hey, I replied, the sound of his voice reassuring and guilt-inducing at the same time. How's your shift going? Long, he admitted. But at least I'll be home tomorrow night. Maybe we can finally have dinner together. That would be nice, I said, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. I missed him, I did, but his absence had become so routine that I hardly knew how to fill the void. After I hung up, I found David in the living room, sprawled on the sofa with his laptop. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. Dad? Yes, I said, sitting in the armchair opposite him. He says hello. David. He nodded, his focus returning to the screen. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the faint clicking of his keyboard. It was a comfortable silence, but the memory of our conversation lingered, casting a shadow over the moment. Mom, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Yes? Can I ask you something? I hesitated, unsure if I was ready for what was to come. Of course. He closed his laptop and set it aside as he turned to face me. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. What do you mean? In your marriage, he said, his voice steady but soft. Are you happy with Dad? I stared at him, the weight of the question pressing down on me. That's a complicated question, David. He nodded, as if expecting the answer. I see how much you do, how much you give, and I wonder if anyone does the same for you. David, I started, but the words caught in my throat. Your father loves me. I'm sure he does, he said quietly. But does he make you feel loved? The question hit me like a punch in the gut, forcing me to confront feelings I'd buried for years. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Instead, I stood up abruptly, needing to escape the intensity of the moment. I need to check on dinner, I said, and retreated to the kitchen. The following days passed in a blur of tension and avoidance. I threw myself into chores and errands, trying to keep my mind busy, but David's words lingered like an echo in my head. Was I happy? Did I feel loved? The questions gnawed at me, forcing me to face truths I wasn't ready to face. David, for his part, seemed to sense my turmoil. He gave me space, retreating to his room or spending long hours away from the house. But when we were in the same room, the unspoken tension crackled like a live wire, impossible to ignore. One evening, while I was folding laundry in the living room, David sat on the floor nearby, scrolling through his phone. The silence was almost comforting, a rare moment of peace in the storm. But then he looked up, his gaze pensive. Mom, he said, his voice breaking the silence. Yes? I've been thinking about what I said the other day, about Dad. I tensed, braced myself. David, I'm... Sorry, he interrupted, his tone sincere. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I care about you and I want you to be happy. I know, I said quietly, putting the folded towel down. And I appreciate that, but you don't have to worry about me. He nodded. his expression unreadable. I just hate to see you carry so much alone. I smiled weakly and reached out to shake his hand. I'm stronger than I look, sweetheart. He smiled back, his fingers lingering on mine for a moment before pulling away. The touch was brief, innocent, but it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment in my mind, the warmth of his hand still lingering. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting connection born of shared concern. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The line between us had been blurred, and I didn't know how to unblur it. The next morning, I resolved to regain control of my emotions and the dynamics of our home. I couldn't let these lingering thoughts, small gestures, and heavy words consume me. I buried myself in dinner preparations, knowing that my husband would be home tonight after his shift. If nothing else, I needed to remind myself of the stability his presence brought. David hovered in the kitchen doorway as I worked, leaning casually against the frame. "You're going all out," he remarked, his eyes flickering to the roast I was preparing. "Your dad deserves a nice dinner," I replied, concentrating on the chopping board. "It's been a long week for him." David crossed his arms, a hint of a grin on his face. "And for you, huh?" I didn't answer, refusing to meet his gaze. The words carried a weight that I didn't want to unpack. Instead, I busied myself with seasoning the roast, ignoring the heat that rose in my chest under his scrutiny. "You're tense," he said after a moment, his voice softer now. "You've been tense for days." "No, I'm fine," I said firmly, finally turning to face him. "David, I need you to give me some space." His grin faltered, replaced by a look of quiet concern. "Have I done something wrong?" "No," I said quickly. "It's just that things are complicated and I need some time to think." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'll get out of your way then." The pang of guilt that followed his retreat was immediate, but I forced myself to push it aside. Boundaries had to be drawn, and this was the first step. That evening, the house felt almost normal again. My husband sat at the head of the dining table, his laughter filling the room as he told stories from his shift. David joined in, adding his own jokes and observations. I smiled along, grateful for the respite from the tension that had plagued the house. But even as I sat there, surrounded by the comforting rhythm of family, my eyes occasionally drifted to David. The way he laughed, the easy confidence in his posture, it was impossible to ignore the change in him since he'd returned from college. He was no longer the boy I'd helped raise. He was a man, and that realization only made things more complicated. After dinner, my husband retired to the living room, exhausted from his long shift. I cleared the table, grateful for the solitude, but it didn't last long. David reappeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room in a way that was both comforting and suffocating. "Need a hand?" he asked. "I've got it," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. He came closer anyway, picking up a pile of plates and carrying them to the sink. "You don't have to do everything yourself, you know." I sighed, putting the dishcloth down and turning to face him. "David, I told you, I need space." "I know," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But I can't just stand by and watch you carry all this alone. It's not fair." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. He was so close now, his expression serious and unyielding. For a moment, the air between us felt too heavy, too charged. "I care about you," he said softly, the words hanging in the air like a confession. "David," I started, but he shook his head. "I know what you're going to say," he interrupted, "and I understand. But I needed you to know." Before I could answer, he stepped back, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I'll go," he said quietly, turning and walking away. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his words hanging over me like a storm cloud. That night, sleep once again eluded me. My husband lay beside me, his breathing deep and even as he slept, but my thoughts raced. David's words echoed in my mind, mingled with the lingering warmth of his presence. I knew I needed to set firmer boundaries to regain control of the situation, but the attraction between us was undeniable. The next morning, I awoke early, hoping to clear my head with a brisk walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool and crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden rays. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a reminder of the stability I'd been longing for. But when I returned home, David was in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand, leaning against the counter. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a softness in his eyes that made my resolve waver. "Good morning," he said, his tone light but cautious. "Morning," I replied, putting my keys on the counter. "You're up early." He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." I hesitated, not sure what to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, his gaze steady, "about what you said, about boundaries." I swallowed hard and nodded. "Good. That's good. I want to respect them," he continued, "but I also want to be honest with you." "David," I started, but he held up his hand. "Just let me say this," he said, his voice calm but serious. "I know this isn't easy, and I don't want to make it harder for you, but I can't ignore how I feel." His words hung in the air, a confession that made my heart race and my stomach churn. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know." With that, he set down his coffee and walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. The days that followed were a careful balancing act. I threw myself into chores, errands, anything that kept me busy and distant from David. But the unspoken tension between us remained, impossible to ignore. Every look, every brush of his hand as we passed, felt loaded with meaning. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, or if he was trying to give me the space I'd asked for. He spent more time in his room, more hours away from the house. When he was home, he was warm but distant, as if he too was trying to navigate this fragile terrain. One afternoon, I was in the garden, trimming the hedges. It was mindless work, the rhythmic snipping of the shears grounding me in a way few things can. The sun was warm on my back, and for a moment I felt almost at peace. And then, I heard his voice behind me. "You've been out here for hours." I turned to see David standing on the terrace, a glass of water in his hand. He looked relaxed, his expression soft, but the weight of his gaze was undeniable. "It's good for me," I said, forcing a smile. "Helps clear my head." He stepped closer and set the glass down on the small table near the patio chair. "You shouldn't push yourself." I shrugged and turned back to the hedge. "I like to keep busy." "I've noticed," he said, his voice quieter now. I concentrated on the shears, pretending I hadn't heard the undercurrent in his tone. But he wasn't leaving. I could feel him standing there, watching me. "Can we talk?" he finally asked, his voice calm but hesitant. "David," I started, but he cut me off. "Please," he said, "just for a minute." I sighed, put the scissors down, and turned to face him. "Okay, what is it?" He took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He gave me a look, one eyebrow raised, as if to say, "Really?" I sighed again and crossed my arms over my chest. "Okay, fine. Maybe things have been tense, but that doesn't mean we can't put it behind us." "I want to," he said, coming closer, "but it feels like every time I try, I just make things worse." "You're not," I said quietly, though my chest tightened as I spoke. "We just need time." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I care about you, Mum. Maybe more than I should. But I don't want to hurt you." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. and for a moment I couldn't breathe. David, this isn't right. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it doesn't change the way I feel. The silence between us was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I looked away, my mind racing for something to say, anything to make it all go away. But before I could speak, he stepped back, his stance resolute. I'll give you the space you need, he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the garden, my heart pounding, and my mind a chaotic mess. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. My husband was working late again, and David had retired to his room. I sat on the sofa with a glass of wine in my hand, staring at the television without really watching it. The events of the day replayed in my mind, every word, every look, gnawing at me. I knew I should feel relief that David had decided to step down, but instead I felt a pain I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the guilt or the confusion. It was the loss of something I hadn't even realized I valued. As the night wore on, I found myself walking down the corridor to David's room. I stopped in front of his door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I doing? What was I going to say? Do? I shook my head and forced myself to step back. This was madness. I couldn't let myself get caught up in these feelings, whatever they were. I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me with a shaky breath. The next morning, David. He was up and dressed when I came down. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his expression neutral but cautious. "Good morning," he said, his tone cautious. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "You're up early." "Thought I'd get out for a while," he said, glancing at his watch. "Clear my head?" "That sounds like a good idea," I said, though the thought of him leaving sent a strange pang through me. He got up, picked up his cup, and rinsed it in the sink. "I'll be back later." "Take your time," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded and threw his jacket over his shoulder as he headed for the door. "See you later." I watched him go, the sound of the door closing echoing in the silence. The house felt emptier without him, the silence oppressive. I tried to occupy myself with chores, but nothing could distract me from the nagging sense of unease. When he returned that evening, I had persuaded myself to talk to him, to clear the air once and for all. But when he walked through the door, his expression was different, lighter, almost serene. "Hey," he said, putting his keys down on the counter. "Dinner smells good." I nodded, my resolve wavering under the warmth of his smile. "Thanks, it'll be ready in a minute." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Mom, thank you for everything." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I nodded again, unable to find the words to reply. He smiled and brushed past me on his way to his room. For the first time in days, the tension between us felt manageable. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to normal. "You don't have to pretend to be interested," I said with a wry smile, pointing at the screen. "There's nothing good on." He chuckled and put the remote down. "Just trying to fill the silence." "I like the silence sometimes," I said, though the truth was more complicated than that. Silence could be soothing, but it could also be suffocating, amplifying thoughts I didn't want to face. Then he turned to me, his expression pensive. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated, but nodded. "Of course." "Are you happy?" he asked, echoing the question that had haunted me for weeks. I sighed and put my book down. "David, that's a difficult question to answer." "Why?" he pressed, his gaze steady. "You deserve to be happy." "I am," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I have a good life, a loving husband, a wonderful family." He leaned forward, tugging at my thoughts. "That's not what I asked," he said quietly. "Are you happy?" I looked away, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "Maybe I haven't given it enough thought." "You should," he said, his voice soft but insistent. You give so much to everyone else. Maybe it's time to think about what you need. The words struck a chord deep within me, stirring emotions I wasn't ready to face. David, I started, but he shook his head. I'm not trying to make things difficult for you, he said quickly. I care about you, Mum, and I want you to be okay. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And I appreciate that. But some things aren't that easy. His expression lingered for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. Then he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. I think I should get back to campus, he said quietly. I've been meaning to anyway. There's a lot I need to sort out. The words sent a pang through me, but I nodded, knowing it was the right decision. If that's what you think is best, I murmured. He offered a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. It is. The next morning, David packed his things and said goodbye. My husband, unaware of the tension beneath the surface, patted him on the back and told him to come and see us soon. I stood at the door, my heart heavy as I watched David load his car. Take care of yourself, I said as he turned to me. You too, he replied, his gaze lingering on mine. And thanks for everything. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He got into his car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove off. I stood there long after he was gone, the emptiness of the house now mirrored in my chest. The weeks that followed were even quieter. Without David's presence, the house felt emptier, though I told myself that was a good thing. I threw myself into routines, trying to fill the void with productivity. But late at night, when the house was quiet, my thoughts drifted back to him. Had I done the right thing? Had we both? The answers felt elusive, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. My husband noticed the change in me, though he didn't press me. You've been quiet lately, he said one evening, as we sat down to dinner. Just tired, I said with a slight smile. It's been a busy couple of weeks. He nodded, accepting the excuse, but his gaze lingered, as if he sensed there was more beneath the surface. As the days turned into months, I found myself thinking more and more about the questions David had asked. Was I happy? Did I feel loved? They weren't questions with easy answers, but they forced me to face truths I'd been avoiding for years. My marriage wasn't perfect, far from it. The distance between my husband and I had grown over time, a slow drift that neither of us had addressed. But was it beyond repair? Or was there still something worth saving? One evening, as we sat in the living room, I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. Charles, I began, my voice shaky. Can we talk? He looked at me, his expression curious but concerned. Of course. What's on your mind? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But then I thought of David, of his insistence that I deserved to be happy, and I found the courage to speak. I feel we've been distant, and I think we need to work on that. Charles frowned, his forehead furrowed. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I want us to get back together, to figure out how to make this work again. For a moment, he didn't answer, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for my hand, his grip tight but warm. I want that too, he said quietly. I've been so caught up in work, I didn't realize how much I'd neglected us. I'm sorry. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away and nodded. We'll figure it out, I said. Together. In the months that followed, we worked to rebuild the connection we'd lost. It wasn't easy. Relationships never are. But we made progress, step by step. And although the memory of those tense weeks remained, I chose to see them as a catalyst for change, a reminder of what I truly valued. As for David, his visits became less frequent, but our bond remained intact. When he came home for the holidays, we shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement to leave the past where it belonged. And as I stood in the kitchen one evening, Watching my family laughing and talking around the dinner table, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The questions that had haunted me were still there, but their edges had softened, leaving room for hope and possibility. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again,